I would like to welcome you all to the 5th seminar of the AI and CSS seminar series by MACSSL and GLODEM. Today we have a really interesting talk by Dr. Cansu Canca. She is going to talk about a very important topic that is very much also speaking to the current debates we're having on practice and governance of AI ethics. And before I give the floor to Dr. Canca, I would also like to briefly introduce her to you for those of you who don't know her. Dr. Cansu Canca is a philosopher and the founder and director of the AI Ethics Lab, where she leads teams of computer scientists, philosophers, and legal scholars to provide ethics analysis and guidance to researchers and practitioners. She also serves as an ethics expert in various ethics advisory and editorial boards. She has a PhD in philosophy, specializing in applied ethics, and she primarily works on ethics of technology, having previously worked on ethics and health. Prior to the AI Ethics Lab, she was a lecturer at the University of Hong Kong and a researcher at the Harvard Law School and Harvard School of Public Health and Harvard Medical School and National University of Singapore, Osaka University, and the World Health Organization. She was listed among the 30 influential women advancing AI in Boston and the 100 brilliant women in AI ethics. She's also the first technology AI ethicist in Turkey. We're delighted to have her here today with us. Without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Canca.
Thank you very much. That is, so let me, all right, let me start. So thank you very much for having me. I am gonna talk about practice and governance of AI ethics. I'll try to keep it relatively short, although I never managed to keep it very short, so that we have enough time to have questions and answers, which is always the more fun part of these presentations, in my opinion. So when we've been talking about AI ethics for a very long time, and it sounds like it's been a hit topic for a while, but it's actually quite recent. So this is the last 10 years. When you look at the last 10 years of Google search trends, AI ethics, or any variation of this term, so ethics of AI, ethics of technology, any of these variations don't really appear in the search results as much until sort of late 2016, actually 17. So here's a zoom in to the last 5 years, and you see that towards the mid to late 2017, it starts picking up, and that's really that really started to happen when scandals started to happen. So the Cambridge Analytica, Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal was really a turning point for how much we start talking about AI ethics. And when you look at this graph, it's eye-catching. There's a spike in 2019. That is May 2019, and in the same month, what happened is EU published its trustworthy AI guidelines. Google has put together an ethics board, and in the same week of all of these happening, Google disassembled its its ethics board. So things didn't go well in a very quick way, and they had to get rid of their ethics board. So this is sort of like how the conversation has been going in some sense. It sounds like we've been talking about it a lot, but it's really a much more recent hot topic. Another way that I can show you this is a tool that we have created in AI Ethics Lab. So this is Dynamics of AI Principles. Again, we hear companies talk about their AI principles very often recently. So we were curious to see when did this started to happen, and in what kind of patterns have there been in these AI principles world. So what we did is we put together all the existing AI principles that's been published all around the world. And in 2015, this is how our map looked like. And in 2020, this is how our map looks like now. We have over 100 sets of AI principles published around the world, of course, concentrated in certain areas of the world. And it is also, wait a second, I have to, so sorry, I have to give a pause and turn off my notifications. 1 second. Very sorry about that. Right. All right, so this is how our map looks like now. And we have concentration of AI ethics principles in certain parts of the world. And when you look at our toolbox, you can also compare these documents and see their differences, but more like see how they are emphasizing similar points. But the point that I wanted to make is that AI ethics, AI principles have been a very rapidly developing topic, which also comes with the problem, of course, well, while we are talking about the headline, what happens into the content? Are we actually giving enough attention to the content? What do we really mean when we say AI ethics and when we say AI ethics principles and operationalizing these principles? So I know this is sort of like super basic slide, but I think it's safe to have it. It's safer to have this rather than speaking past each other. So when we say ethics, what we are talking about is really determining the right action to take and the just policy to implement in any given situation. So we are trying to answer, what should we do? What is the right decision to make? And we are talking about something analytical, something systematic, something that is not subjective. So it's not about your inner moral compass, so to speak, which is a phrase that appears in a lot of these writings. And it is action guiding. So it has to be whatever AI ethics, AI principles we are talking about, it has to be action guiding. Now, when we come to the AI ethics, what we are really covering in terms of space is, first of all, the content, the product. So we are talking about developing ethical technologies. The other aspect is the process. How do we develop these technologies? Can we ensure that we are using ethical processes for technology development? And the final one is the implementation. We have to pay attention, we have to discuss the using and implementing technology ethically. So this is sort of the broader scope of AI ethics when we are, the areas to which these principles and these conversations should apply. Now, so I'm going to give an example to sort of put things into a little bit more concretely, and I'm just going to sort of briefly talk about this. I know this is a huge topic, so if you want to come back to this example later in the questions and answers, we can do that. So predictive policing is one area that has been very, both in terms of academic and technology development, but also in terms of ethical criticism, it has been a very hot area. I have also done couple of sessions with police chiefs in the United States, police chiefs, FBI in the United States, and I am also involved in an EU project that is, as an ethics board member, in an EU project that's developing, that's looking to develop predictive policing technologies. So the problem that so when you talk to the police chiefs, the problem that they face is there are extremely high rates of violent crime. And most often these extremely high rates of violent crime is concentrated in the districts where there is also huge lack of resources. So they need any help, whatever help they can get in order to tackle this issue, because their own typical traditional resources is just not sufficient to handle the crisis that they face. So the technology comes in with a promise. They say that, well, we can predict where and when the crime will happen and who will be committing the crime. Of course, this is an extremely forceful way of saying what the technology actually can potentially do. The more realistic way of saying this would be, well, we might give you some probabilistic idea of where the crime and when the crime might potentially happen, and put some sort of variables about who might be the one that you, the higher risk individuals might be. Even that, of course, is like the sentence itself has a lot of questions that we should ask in terms of ethics. But let me put it this way: when you talk to, like, in real life, what happens is that when you talk to the chiefs, the police chiefs, they're extremely excited to hear this, and they don't really even know what questions to ask about the technology. What they really want to know is, does anyone that I like and trust use this technology? So can I go ahead and employ this technology because I need help? So once you look at the technology that either is developed or is being developed is in the process of being developing, of course, you have many questions where the ethical decision making is already present, whether it is by knowing or without realizing. So either the developers already asking these questions when they are developing the technology, or they are completely, well, maybe completely is a bit exaggeration, but they are not very aware that these are ethically relevant questions. Nonetheless, they make a decision on this, so they are embedding the answers to these questions into the technology, whether or not they discuss this. So the data, of course, there's a huge variety of questions about the data. How do you, first of all, how do you get the data to build any predictive policing technology? If you are using models that already exist, are you using data that was collected for a different purpose? So are you using now a secondary, is this what you're doing, secondary use of data? And is it ethically valid? Or did they consent to this? Did the data subjects knew about this? Or even is this within the realm of the possibilities that they have considered when they gave their data, or when their data was collected without their knowledge? Whenever we talk about crime data, we have to also acknowledge that crime data comes with historical and social biases embedded in it. So when the data says, for example, that even minor crimes are high in certain neighborhoods, certain socioeconomically or racially different neighborhoods. So could be in the US, we would say usually the neighborhoods with more African Americans. Well, that also comes with the background story where the police is more present and police is more inclined to engage with the individuals and bring them into the criminal justice system by ticketing them, by taking them under custody. So in a way, the same crime might be completely invisible in other neighborhoods because the police is simply not present there. That already brings a bias to the data that you are using in a way that is extremely difficult to sort of sort out. So in a different way than, for example, how you would sort out the data that does not have enough variety of gender information, where you can see that this is the problem and you could take actions for rectifying it in most cases, but not in all cases, of course. And then comes so there are more questions. I'm just giving some examples, but there are many questions already embedded in the data that you are going to use in order to build these models. But then of course you come to the stage of building the model, and you have to make a lot of decisions about which proxies you're going to use, what kind of variables you're going to employ, and how are you going to weigh them. And finally, in designing the tool, by which I mean like the user interface that you are eventually going to create, what does this tool say to the police chief, for example? What kind of, does it just say a number? Does it just show that a hotspot in a red color, which does not really convey much information? And it doesn't say much about its certainty, its potential loopholes, and in any way that the human officer can interact with this information. Can the human officer ask questions to this dashboard, let's say? And finally, whatever that dashboard says, how do the police use this dashboard? So when they see a potential crime an area where the crime is likely to happen, are they sending more police forces, or are they do they send more social workers, because they know that certain areas have criminal activity much more because of mental health problems, or things that can be handled with public health officials rather than public safety officials. So all of these are within the technology ethics. And if we are talking about an AI product, then it's within the AI ethics. So when I sort of showed you these three main areas, the way that we have to engage with these three main areas is both with engaging with the design of an AI system and with the by setting the rules and safeguards of how to do all of these three things in the development, in the innovation process. So safeguards around how to do the research and development in AI systems, or how to use the AI systems. So in a way, the AI ethics scope is quite large, and also in a way that it has a variety of tools to employ, both in the design part and in the rule setting, safeguard setting part. So so everything I just explained really encompasses this spectrum of research, development, design, implementation, and updating of a product, and within which we are talking about the data, the algorithm, the tool, the product itself, and eventually the practice, the use of this product. And I don't think I have the slide here for this, but let me just say, in the typical research ethics, for example, if you are doing a human subject research in an academic setting or in a clinical setting, the typical system that we engage with in research ethics is ethics oversight and ethics compliance structure. So the institutional review boards or research ethics committees, depending on which part of the world you are doing your research. So they are called those two. And the way that the ethics boards and ethics committees engage with research is at the very beginning, at the start point, with looking at the protocol, research protocol, and giving an ethics approval, and eventually, depending on what type of a research we are talking about, maybe checking back on you at a certain time, maybe a year into your research, research progress, but in a very distant and very approval, non-approval structure. What I just showed, though, does not really cannot really benefit enough. This would not be the fitting structure, because if we did that, we would only cover the research part, but all of these other questions will be still open, and there is no real ethics guidance for all of these other questions. So some of the questions that often arise, I just listed them to give an idea, are types of questions that an ethics review board is not necessarily is an underestimation, is most often unable to engage with in a deep manner. So the algorithmic bias question, the secondary user re-identification of data, the data ownership, the consent question in a continuous use, and where systems are learning as users are still using the product, the risk assessment, the function creep, black box situation, dual use, inclusivity, externalities of the technology. These are way more complicated than 5-6 people research ethics board to be able to approve and see through. So what we need is a system that starts with analyzing the domain and the technology, and then looks and engages with all of these questions about the data, the algorithm, the research and development of ethics and design, and eventually really also encompasses this ensuring the ethical use of the technology by the user. And here, really, the user, I'm not talking about the individual, civil individual user, but I'm talking more about either the hospital, the judicial system, and the officials, officers within these systems. Or could be, like a bank, including the private sector, of course, like a bank, financial systems, and bank officers, and so on. So what we suggest is to really not so, in a academic manner, it is not very innovative. In a practice, it is sort of innovative way of looking at ethics, which is puzzle solving in ethics, the PI model. So why do I say it's not very innovative in an academic sense? Well, because that's what philosophers do. Any philosopher will say, well, that's what I do anyway. So what are you talking about, a new model? What I'm really saying is, yes, we should look at the ethical issues in practice, like philosophers look at ethical issues in their normal academic practice, so to speak. Looking at potential risks and looking at potential opportunities and the existing safeguards and what safeguards we might need to implement, existing design opportunities, and what we can utilize. Really looking at it as a collaborative effort rather than ethics policing, which is what we do in practice in research ethics, for example, or ethics compliance, which is the ethics in industry. And within that model, the way we set it up, we identified is 4 main components. So ethics roadmap, which I'm going to talk about at the very end, but more importantly, ethics analysis, ethics strategy, and ethics training. And again, for the practice, these would be putting them all together brings you a comprehensive ethics practical ethics implementation. For a philosopher, that's what you should be doing anyway. So ethics analysis is really about recognizing and mitigating the complex ethics risks and also identifying ethics opportunities. So when we talk about AI ethics, I think oftentimes we are very focused on what can go wrong. But there's this other aspect of it, which is what is already wrong in the world and what can be used in technology to fix it, to help make it better. So an example that I often give, for example, is that in healthcare, women's guidelines, clinical guidelines, are often not very accurate, often very inaccurate, let's put it more strongly, for women and for children, because women and children are often excluded from clinical trials because healthcare system and research ethics wants to protect children who cannot consent and wants to protect pregnant women. So they exclude a lot of potentially pregnant women, which is a huge age group, of course. By doing so, though, we end up with this problem where a lot of the knowledge, evidence-based knowledge we have in healthcare is just not really accurate and not applicable for women. This is an ethics opportunity because there's an ethical issue. So if we can use a technology system where we can gather more data about women and children, that is going to be using technology to catch an ethics opportunity and utilize it. And for example, systems that look at patients like me or patients like mine and look at millions of electronic healthcare records to gather evidence from those records does just that. So in ethics analysis, we want to identify these risks and opportunities in a project or a product, and do this through analysis of the domain and the technology and finding a set of right actions to take in order to pursue this project or pursue the development of this product. I say a set of right actions because one thing that's often pointed out about ethics is that you might not have one right answer, which is correct, but which does not mean that you don't have any right answer. So we should understand it more like we can identify a lot of the wrong answers. Maybe you're going to have more than one equally justifiable answer, right action, great, then you have you can choose whichever one you want without being forced to, without ethically being obligated to. Or maybe you are going to have a direct guidance, this is the right action to take, or this is the right way to pursue this project. Ethics strategy is sort of means to do this ethics analysis in a more in a way, scale it up within the organization. You don't want to start your analysis from scratch every single time that you see a project or a product. What you want to do is to have a sense of where your values are, how your values align, what kind of trade-offs as an organization, a company, or an academic organization you are generally going for. And have some sort of precedence. You know, what did you decide in a similar setting before? Can we use that? Can we use some shortcuts for setting the doing these analyses? And have some guidance for the developers, for the leadership, and for the ethicists who are working with this particular company or an organization. So we need, remember all of these AI ethics principles. So we use these AI ethics principles, but we really need to operationalize them. I'll get to that in a minute. We need to have processes in place. So when do you, at what points do you check back with the ethics experts? How do you identify when is a complex ethical question is blocking your way? And when is it something that you can really sort out yourself within the team? And what kind of precedents you have in order to get some guidance? And finally, you know, when I say what kind of simple decisions you can take in order to deal with some less complex ethical issues, well, that requires some training for the teams, for non-ethicists. So we need to have ethics training for technology developers and technology and leadership within this realm, as well as the users in certain institutional settings. But especially when we look at the technology development, we need to have ethics training in order to catch early stage and simple and complex ethical issues, and solve simple ones if it is easy to solve, and flag the harder ones for help. Sort of think of it like the legal aspect. You know, in designing new products, you do flag certain questions for legal teams to take a look at because you're unsure, and you do quick checkups on your own for simple questions. So sort of like that style. And we do this by training the teams, those who engage in technology development for ethics, risk analysis, opportunity analysis, and some skills and tools for ethical problem solving. And finally, the ethics roadmap is really just putting all of these together for the company. So it's not the most integral part of this model, so to speak, but it is more like how should the company or an organization prioritize its ethical needs, what kind of resources it should allocate, and does it have to engage in like 101 things like culture setting? You know, should you talk about have you ever talked about ethics in the organization before? Should you start talking about ethics in the organization and raising awareness, and then start these trainings and perhaps having ethics experts being involved? I'm going to give few examples of these quickly. So in ethics training, for example, we have done modules, we wrote modules and done some trainings on artificial intelligence and human subject protection. The reason being, when we look at the human subject protection landscape and the research ethics as it exists today, their guidance don't really match the questions that AI research raises. So, for example, consent in a lot of the AI digital research, let's say, in online settings, is not the informed consent that we are talking about in clinical or behavioral research when you do it in a physical space. So if we cannot say that this is informed consent, then we have questions to answer. Do we need informed consent from subjects, or is this too the risk is too low that we don't need to engage in informed consent? If so, should we still pretend to have informed consent by having people press I agree buttons? Or should we just drop the pretense and say, hey, this is really not about consent anymore? So these questions arise, and currently the research ethics landscape does not really have answers for these questions. So what we did with these trainings was honestly not really giving them many answers, but sort of telling the research ethics officers what they don't know, what they should be thinking about when they see AI research, and what kind of aspects that they should be asking more questions about, and where we as ethicists need to do more work and provide more guidance. I am bracketing the question, how much research ethics officers and IRBs should be involved in AI research? That's a different question that's worthwhile to discuss on its own. Another type of training that we did is algorithmic bias training, where it's really, I mean, something that is missing in a lot of these discussions is a well-structured and well-explained way of how the problem can occur and what kind of solutions are available. So not even going into the details of, for this very complex question, how could you solve it? But more like saying, hey, did you realize these are the issues? And here are some ways of solving them. And here are some resources that you can use. In ethics analysis, going back to these AI principles, so one of the things that we have done is, by the way, I am talking about what we have done, but I can also sort of change my language to say I think one should do, because like we have done the things I think one should do. So like in this area of research, one should do. How do we actually make sense of these AI principles? You can ask this as a more broader academic question. You know, what does all of these AI principles say, and what kind of patterns come out of them? Or you can ask this more practical question. I work in a company that has released these AI principles. What am I going to do with them? So what we did is we tried to figure out a way of operationalizing them. The first thing is, of course, AI principles, the published AI principles, don't come in a conceptually consistent manner. What I mean is, in the same set of principles with equal importance, you will see we respect autonomy, which is a very core idea coming from, you know, like the depths of moral philosophy. But you would also see something like, and we under all circumstances, we protect privacy, which is more of an instrumental idea. Privacy is not a core principle. Oh, I am in light, sorry. Not sure how to catch this, get rid of this light, but so privacy is something that is instrumental in order to protect individual autonomy, allow individuals to decide what to share and what not to share, and potentially protect them from harm. Instead, what we have with these AI principle sets is that they are putting all of them together in a way that if you want to operationalize, well, should you be prioritizing privacy or autonomy? And is this even a sensible question if they are not, if they are apples and oranges? I have to cut this light, I believe, before I look like that works. All right.
Hocam, you look great.
I'm worried that I'm going to blind you with that light coming from the side. So we basically put all of the AI principles under 4 headings. The 4 headings that has been used in research ethics and bioethics as the principalism framework, and it's also the principles that the EU's trustworthy AI framework has used, except explicability, because even though they put these 4 principles, autonomy, harm, and fairness and explicability, in the same heading, they also recognize that explicability is an enabling principle. So we fix that mistake in the EU's guideline, and instead put the 4 principles, merge the 2, harm, minimize harm and maximize benefit into harm benefit, which is often done in the literature anyway. So it's either 4 principles or 3 principles framework, depending on how you phrase it, and put all the relevant instrumental principles next to them in a way that you can see that these are the instrumental instruments that you can use in order to uphold these principles. And as a developer, here is or as an ethicist, here's a tool that you can sort of start your check of ethical concerns and see where your tool is, your product, your tool, your project is weak, where that weakness is really leading to. So is it a weakness that is increasing the potential of risk of harm? Is it a weakness that is about the fairness question? So where is that weakness in it is really leading? And are there other principles that you can use, other instruments that you can use to mitigate this weakness? So a simple example here would be for using privacy and consent. If the data is completely anonymized, then even if we don't get your consent, we can protect your privacy because it's not anymore attached to you in most cases, let's say. If we cannot trace the data back to you, so it's not an identifiable data, then we don't necessarily need your consent. So that's one way of protecting your autonomy, upholding your autonomy, even though we might not be able to use all of the instrumental principles. And by the way, it's clear that we cannot at all times fulfill all instrumental principles because there will be clashes, there will be trade-offs. That is what a hard ethical question brings necessarily. So this is something that we use for ethics analysis. We ourselves, we started using this ourselves, but we also help train developers to use this again as a starting point. No checkbox, no checklist is sufficient for ethical evaluation, ethical analysis. Asking for one is being misguided. But what we can do is we can provide checklists and checkboxes in order to start the conversation and help non-ethicists articulate the problems that they are facing. I have also written an article on this if you want to read it more in detail. And in ethics strategy, one similar way of thinking is, as a company, how do you prioritize when autonomy and justice clash, when privacy and safety clash? Do you actually, because when you put out these principles, supposedly, presumably, those are for strategy, for having your, I hope I have the, so for having your ethics strategy boards, these ethics advisory boards, to be able to use these principles and say, well, this decision doesn't align with our principles. That means that those principles has to mean something, has to suggest some sort of prioritization. So if you're not talking about agency, should we assume that agency is less important for you? But let's say equality, non-discrimination that you have mentioned in your principles is really something that you want to prioritize. By experience, I can say that most companies have not thought of their principles in these terms. They thought of their principles more like, what words would we like to put forth? What kind of language do we want to present and associate with our image, rather than really action guiding principles where it says, well, you know what, if it is agency versus well-being, societal well-being, we are going to go with well-being. That's what our principles say. And we need those type of action guiding principles if we are going to have any. A company might also choose to say, that's not something that I can put forth. That is something maybe within the company, within our strategic board, within our own decision makers. And that would be a respectable decision. But we have to, these are the things that they have to utilize. And another thing that's that I mentioned before, but that is often not used much, is the precedence. You know, in ethical decision making, if you want to have like a consistent company or consistent organizational ethical decision framework, then we also need to be able to say, here are other use cases where we already made a decision, and how we can utilize them in order to look at this new question that resembles them in various manners. That doesn't have, the precedents don't have to be dictating the new decision. New decision might also be useful in revising and evaluating the older decisions, and allow the company or allow the organization to grow and be more nuanced in its further decisions. So here I want to contrast what I explained in these ethics strategy boards and how they can use principles and precedents to the research ethics and oversight compliance model. Because when I say boards and principles, it sounds awfully like IRBs or research ethics committees. That's not what I mean. The reason why I think they are, I would argue that they are very different, is because I'm not talking about the strategy boards that I'm talking about are not approval boards. They are more like guiding boards for those who are engaging with ethical decision making. In the oversight model, the board really completely relies on principles. They are authoritative, they are distant, and they give pre-approval for any project. And with the strategy boards, I am really talking about sort of streamlining this ethics analysis within the organization and allowing for earlier decisions and earlier value judgments, value trade-offs to feed into the new decisions. So it's very different. And I do think that, again, we can talk about it more in the questions and answers part, but I do think there are significant issues with going with the compliance model for AI ethics. And one more thing that I want to point out is this argument that has appeared a few times, which is about can we use forget about ethics, it is too messy, can we use human rights framework instead in order to make AI ethics more accessible, more universal? And there the idea is we already have a universal agreement about human rights, unlike ethics, where ethics is much more, there is much more competing theories and competing ideas in ethics. So I wrote a piece about this a while ago, and my argument is, no, we cannot use human rights framework instead of ethics. We can use human rights framework in addition to ethics. And the reason being, on the level that we agree on human rights, we also agree on ethics. So these general principles, we all agree from any ethical framework as well. But where you have to make a decision where the human rights principles clash, we have disagreements, and we don't have a universal agreement on what to prioritize. And that is exactly where the ethical theories compete and where ethical principles also clash. So the simple guidance that they provide is both a good starting point, but further complication we cannot avoid by switching to human rights framework. And in fact, in order to make sense of human rights framework, in addition to the human rights instruments, the legal instruments, we always use moral and political philosophy, hence ethical reasoning. So this is just my very last slide to sort of show this coming from human rights framework, what is really the relationship between ethics and law, which oftentimes gets obscured in the conversations of AI ethics. Sometimes when we ask a question about AI ethics, we get an answer about the regulation and other way around. And the relationship is really in many directional. So one is that in order to make any decision about a policy to implement. I'm getting a bit of an echo okay, better now. So in order to implement any policy, we have to first decide what is the right policy to implement. And that is the ethical discussion that we have to have prior to deciding what type of a regulation we should develop and how that fits to other existing regulatory structures. But once the law is there, once the regulation is there, of course, that has to feed into our ethical judgment. When we are making these ethics analyses and strategies and all of those, it is helpful and guiding to have the legal structure, because the legal system really helps set the threshold and set the boundaries of what we should be thinking in our ethical analysis. And that's when the legal system is, of course, justifiable. So if we've done it from the beginning quite well, if we have to sort of argue whether the law is ethical or not, then that's not that useful. But assuming that is, that will feed into our ethical judgment. But even if it is, it could be the case that certain ethical arguments and further complications will eventually feed back into the legal system and allow us to, again, revise and reassess the regulatory framework and perhaps change it again to a new version of it. And then we will be in this loop basically for going forward forever. So I believe this was the end of my talk. So if you are, most of the things that I mentioned are available, the resources are available on the website. If you look at our website, there are more details about the Pi model as well. And something that I would like to point out is that this is particularly because of my frustration about how we do AI ethics in academia, in industry, but let's talk about academia as well here. So I started AI Ethics Lab before Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2016, late 2016. And it is a conversation that was desperately needed back then. And then it became apparent that we desperately need it and still do. But it is still the case that most of the academic and, well, most of the private companies, but even the academic institutions that work on AI or robotics have this language of once we get things going, we'll think about the ethical questions. Ethical questions should not come later. If you are building a center for robotics, you should have the ethics integrated in it from the beginning. So that's my what do you call it? Like a community service message before I close. That's all. Thank you very much.
Hojam, thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. I mean, we spoke about this earlier, but I also actually happen to think that we indeed need a compulsory class on AI ethics for all programs in every university. That's what I personally think that is also what we are going to have soon. But I guess we still need these discussions, and so I really believe this seminar has actually been really useful for that matter. We have a good mix of faculty members, practitioners, grad students, undergrad students from different departments, from engineering, from social sciences, from law. So I'm sure we will be asking you loads of questions. So I'll just jumpstart with the ones we already have in the chat box. I will read them out loud because we're not sharing the chat box, and those who are watching the recording then will be able to hear them as well. Starting with Alperen Demirci. My question is about the definition of ethics. This issue is genuinely one of the largest and hottest topics among philosophers and intellectuals. Many people have different ethical perspectives, and even common ethic rules are being discussed. So in this concept, do the future developers of AI and the users of AI really care the ethics rules? According to your perspective, what may prevent these people from their unethical acts? Or can people agree on common ethic rules about the AI technology? I will read a second question so we can just collect maybe a second batch of questions after that one. Emin Taner Elmas is asking, are they any specific existing AI ethics regulations related with the automobile industry? Are there any standards, norms, etc.? I'll pause here.
Okay, all right. So thank you. And this is actually a good pairing of questions. So I would start with challenging the way that the questions posed. I don't think we should think about ethics as rules, because the whole idea is that it's ethical decision making is really like you have to work it out, you have to analyze it, you have to look at the theories, look at the literature, and figure out what is the right thing to do. So in a way, like in a crude way, let's think about like mathematics. You know, yeah, you have some rules to do how to do math, but you don't have a rule about, you know, what is the answer of this question. And for that reason, I think rules are, when we talk about ethics rules, they are the shortcuts. So if you don't have time, if you don't have the ability, the resources to think about the question, we have the shortcut. Think about it like do not lie type of rule, right? Yeah, you shouldn't lie, but can you safely say that from all ethical perspectives, you should not lie under any circumstances? No, there will be competing ideas. And when I say, for example, that we will not necessarily have one right answer, that's what I mean. So in practicing ethics, of course, you can say as an ethicist, I am this type of ethicist. I'm a utilitarian or I'm a Kantian, and this is what I'm going to provide you with. The answer that I'm going to provide you with, which is not something that it's not very useful, because most of the people that you are advising might not agree with your starting point. So what is much more reasonable to do is, what are these different theories suggest? Do they converge? Do you have a right answer using all of these different theories? If it's a very simple question, by the way, yes, you will have a one right answer. Or do you have competing answers? In which case, are they equally justifiable? In which case, well, you are the subject, choose among them, because you are sort of equally supported. This is what the principalism framework does, by the way. For doctors, for researchers, this is what we've been using. It is a starting point, but I am not very happy with the principalism framework, because it is perceived as it is also the end point, which is false. It is only your starting point. I'm reading the last part of the question. So for people to prevent people from unethical acts, that's the motivation question, right? Like, so you have the rules. Are there ethical rules? Yes and no. How do we prevent people from acting unethically? Well, if they are sufficiently agreed upon, then they are going to be hopefully we can regulate them, we can make them a law. So do not lie, but you cannot defraud people, but that's a law, you know, that's useful. And then you have other incentives, losing trust of your customers, losing profits, losing reputation. But those are motivational things. You can say that, you know, you should be ethically motivated, and that's it. You should not need any incentives. Of course, that's not realistic, but you know. And with the automobile industry, there are standards, there are norms. Yeah, you can check IEEE's the documents on this, for example, the standards. I think recently there was a document that came out from EU about self-driving cars. But regulation and ethics is different, and I am not in the regulatory field, so I am not sufficiently well informed about the law.
Thank you very much, Hojam. I mean, this is something we also discussed, I think, earlier, how we get questions related to regulation, governance. I mean, the moment we start speaking about AI, it's really difficult to narrow it down to AI ethics only, because they are, in a way, also very much entangled, I guess. So I'm reading a second batch, starting with Osama's question. Thanks for your presentation. Do governments have tight regulations on private sector AI research and exploration, or are they still considered very lenient, given the private companies the freedom to do whatever they want in the field of AI? Again, a little bit related to regulation part, I guess. Do you personally think that AI will be regulated by law And if so, how long do you think it will take for laws to be active in the legal system regarding AI? A second question coming from Hassan Berk Artaş. Since the rules of law vary from country to country, whether AI technologies should be handled with a supranational concept, and what is the area where you think the AI ethics relationship will be the hardest to establish? Thanks for the informative presentation.
Thank you very much for listening and asking the questions. For AI research, the rules and regulations for AI research, the many rules and regulations that exist for research apply, most of the time apply for AI research. But as I said, there are AI specific questions that are not yet addressed or tackled sufficiently. But for example, you can think of, I mean, also what counts as an AI regulation? So should we count GDPR as an AI regulation because the data is necessarily needed for the AI research? So it's sort of like it is so closely linked that you might say that, well, that was an AI regulation. And if so, that's one of the most detailed, I think, AI regulation that we have at the moment. Do I think that AI will be regulated? I mean, of course, in the sense that AI is a part of many, will be and is a part of a variety of industries. So, of course, there will be rules in automobile safety that addresses the software and how the software safety should be done or software checks should be done. There will be financial regulation, the financial market regulations that address how AI systems can compete or cannot compete. I mean, automated systems can compete, and similarly, military systems where the automated weapons, lethal weapons, or automated drones, self-flying drones can be used where and what, and all of those things. So there are and there will be. But the question, I mean, I'm not sure if there will be like a headline of here are our AI regulations. It is much more likely to expect, just like many other technologies we have, they will be regulated within the sectors that they are going to be utilized. Saying from a applied philosopher's perspective, let me again qualify this, not a lawyer's perspective. And the second question is, again, I am again answering it from applied philosopher's perspective. The rules of law, yes, I mean, so the AI system does have a particular, AI technologies do have a particular international aspect in a lot of the cases, because the a technology, any given technology, a given technology is very easy to be disseminated around the world, used around the world. An application that is built in one country is easily used in another country. So the speed of which where it becomes available around the world is astonishing, and maybe perhaps it's potentially something that we have not experienced with many other technologies. So yes, there has to be certain international decisions around this, or regional decisions that have international effects. So again, GDPR is one of those things where you have enough of a regional grip, then you can sort of affect the general landscape. And the where the AI ethics relationship will be the hardest to establish, I'm not sure everywhere in all of these, because the ethics questions will be embedded in any, like again, any regulatory decision that we make in any area, by the way. So when we talk about, who to give vaccine, we are also still talking about an ethical decision first before the policy decision. So I'm not sure which one is which one would be the hardest, and then that's a difficult question.
We're asking difficult questions, I think, in the seminar series in general. So thank you so much. Emin Hoca is also thanking you for your answer. I'm reading the other batch. Let's do three questions maybe this time, because we have more questions actually in the chat box. They're kind of raining at the moment. So Senam Imamoglu is asking, even when human rights violations have increased so much and there is a huge problem with the implementation of basic human rights worldwide, what should be done to make AI ethics, which is a much more complex issue, succeed efficiently in practice? Are there any enforcement mechanisms? And then we have another question from Barishcan Karabibar asking, first of all, thanking you very much for the really informative presentation. My question would be, how early do you think should students be exposed to ethical considerations in AI? I wish you a healthy weekend. My short answer is going to be very early on, I'm gonna say. And then the next question is going to be from Martina Romano asking, is it possible that developing the potential of AI could exacerbate/create very strong social inequalities? If yes, how could that be? How could it be possible to manage them? I'll pause here.
Yeah. So starting with the first one, the human rights violations. So in some sense, it is the AI ethics is as complex as human rights issue, because as I said, you can think of AI ethics questions as in the universally agreed upon level, like human rights questions, but then you have these added complications you also have in human rights issues. I am not sure if and also, by the way, human rights framework as it is a way of enforcing ethical practices. So most of the regulatory frameworks that are about human rights or social inequalities and those type of things are, the closer the tie with the ethics, of course, they are more clearly enforcing the ethical decision making. But you can also say that the larger regulatory frameworks, they are all somewhat tied back to any resource allocation is an ethically relevant question. So, for example, but specifically AI, we should also, I think, ask the question, well, for example, how do we think about human rights in relation to certain AI questions? Like, how do we think about your data and your relation to your data in terms of the variety of human rights questions, like your privacy and your right to make decisions and so on. I don't think we are very clear on it yet. And being clear on that will also help going further with this discussion in AI ethics. Again, in order to be clear on that, we need to engage with the AI ethics discussion. So it's like this loops the situation again. And the enforcement mechanism for ethics is always initially the law, because it's sort of like be a good person is not very enforcing. I can tie it to the next question, like if we start any ethical education from as early as possible, critical thinking and ethical thinking from very early on, and expose students to AI ethics in high school, secondary school, specifically AI-related ethical questions, but way early on with the ethical considerations, that would have been great, and maybe we would need less enforcement mechanisms around ethics. But that's idealistic thinking. Maybe we should think more practically, which is we need the laws, we need incentives. And that incentives are also about public reactions, for example. Scandals are how a lot of these ethical systems were put in place. We have the whole research ethics framework because of huge public scandals that erupted around the 1970s. And it sounds like we are having AI ethics conversation because of these public scandals about Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and so on. So the more public is reacting and taking seriously these questions and acting upon, not just like being outraged, but also, well, if Uber is really a problematic company, well, maybe you should consider switching to Lyft, for example, even if it is more costly. So those type of actions, taking action, will be another way of enforcing ethics. And it's always, by the way, like that, not just in AI. Reputational cost is always an important cost for individuals and companies. I answered the second question sort of already with the AI ethics as early as possible. I completely agree with Mary Hoja. But latest, as soon as you enter university. I mean, I don't even understand how we cannot have like very, very rigorous ethics training in university in any field, because that's what you need to do as a citizen. You know, you are making all of these decisions in life. You should be able to make ethical decisions. And finally, inequalities. Yes, the AI holds huge potential, unfortunately, to increase social inequalities. But it also holds potential to decrease social inequalities. So it's really this high risk, high return type of game that we are playing. You can also think about all these different ways that we think about social inequalities. You know, in a Rawlsian manner, you can say, well, but are we really bringing the worst of better? And if we are doing that, maybe the inequalities on the rest of the society is worth it, because the worst off is now better off anyway. Or are we going for as little inequality in the society as possible? And there are all of these different measures that can be taken. Let me just say one thing about one concrete thing about this. For example, when we talk about self-driving cars, a lot of the times the conversation is about who should the car kill in a situation where there is a fatal accident. What we should also be thinking about is, where is the self-driving car gonna go? All of these districts where the roads are not well kept, are the cars not going to go there anymore? So is there going to be even worse transportation situation in some parts of the country, in some parts of the city? And how are we going to deal with this? So we have to think about really these externalities of these technologies when we are thinking about the social inequalities.
Thank you so much, Ajam. In the meantime, Barishbak and Alperen are thanking you very much for your answer. So in the chat box, I see Gülsüm's question, which in a way has been answered. So I will continue with Yağmur Akarken. Thank you for the presentation. In AI, we don't know how the algorithm actually makes decisions. Knowing why the algorithm makes a certain decision, that is, can studying AI provide support for studies in the field of ethics of AI, or will it contribute to it? And then the next question is, thank you for the presentation and sorry for the echo. Okay, don't worry about it, Demet. I'm reading it because there was a slight echo during the presentation, and then I muted Demet. That's what she is, I think, referring to. It's absolutely fine. It happens to me all the time. So Demet's asking, I wonder how often these parameters that you showed are being reviewed, or are the standards changing from case to case? Since these are all dependent on different systems and the discussions on AI are continuing to rise because of AI bias and bias against AI, they should be dynamic. Also, when AI gets this role from humans, it is getting in other fields, what is your prediction about the process of this replacement, or your thoughts on other replacements? Should I read one more question, or should we answer these first?
Let me answer these first.
Okay, sure.
So the first one is about explainable AI, and in some sense, yes, if we can understand how the AI makes decisions, it is easier to judge whether it used an unjustified criteria, whether it used, it was relying on some sort of, for example, an unjustified bias that we have in the society to make its decisions and so on. But, you know, it's very difficult to say that, yes, and therefore we should always have explainable AI, for example, because, well, at what cost, right? Are we gonna, so developing the technology, I think this is something that I didn't say in the presentation, and I think often gets sort of lost in the conversation. Developing the technology is also ethical. These technologies are good, like we are trying to develop technologies that are good for the society. So something that would, for example, slow down the technology is not necessarily an ethical thing to do. I mean, this should be considered as an ethical cost, for example. So if we want to have explainable AI at the cost of, let's say, building a accurate cancer detection tool, that's tricky. Like, yes, this is an area, explainable AI, is an area that we should definitely explore. But in practice, should we have rules and regulations against AI that is black box? That's tough to say. So it's sort of like this two-sided thing. And another thing is that, what do we mean by explainable AI? It's very unclear. It's virtually like we are now talking about looking at these different weights of variables and actually understanding them. Also, if we really understand it by looking at it, probably that AI is not that complicated, in which case we should also ask the question, did we need to use AI in that setting? So in a real complex AI decision making, it's not going to make a lot of sense to just look at the structure of the, let's say, neural network, or the different weight it gives on different nodes and so on. So what are we really talking about? Are we talking about testing methodologies, which is, of course, something that we do, and it's very important, but testing the system to see what variables it used and what proxies it relied on. So let me cut it here, but like, yes, we need explainable AI as a field. I don't think we should necessarily regulate against against the AI that's not explainable. And we should really fix our terminology and what we mean by explainable AI. The second question is, I'm looking at it again. Yeah, so all these different ways of different standards, different ways of making ethical decisions. The way that we are engaging in ethical decision making is not changing, but the way that the application, the sort of the calculation happens, yes, it is case dependent and it does change. But we can also think about, are there things that we as a society want to mandate? Should we say, for example, because it should not be, we should not start from scratch in all decision making. So there should be certain rules against how data is used. What is your data? What should be considered as your data? How much rights should you have on your data? What kind of privacy tools can we use in order to protect your privacy? Certain things we should make decisions. What type of transparency and accountability should we mandate? So certain mandates we should have, and that would be sort of like the threshold and the socially agreed upon points. But then there will be all these open questions, which again exist in all areas. You have them in public health, even though we have a very strong public health law and regulations. But we have all these open questions, and they're oftentimes case by case. And we utilize a lot of the use cases for new cases, as I mentioned in the precedence one as well. And about replacing humans, I think the better way of thinking about AI and humans is AI-human collaboration, and a meaningful AI-human collaboration, ways that we can make individuals understand in relevant ways what the AI system's result is really telling them. So when a doctor sees an AI risk assessment, the doctor, the physician understands on what grounds or with what certainty this number comes to the physician. So this intelligent engagement with the AI system. So we need to develop systems for it, and we need to develop humans for it. So we need to reskill individuals in order to engage with AI systems. And if AI takes over certain human jobs, I don't think that should be viewed as a loss for humanity. I don't think there is shortage of what humans can do in the world. So I think there are economic consequences that must be figured out. But in terms of like human development, human flourishing aspect, if AI can do it, that might also suggest that maybe it's a waste of time for humans to do it.
Thank you very much, Hocam. And Yağmur is also thanking you very much for your answer. And apologies to Yağmur, I misread your question. I didn't see the X in front of AI, but I'm glad Hocam saw that you were asking a question about explaining AI. So let me see what else we have. We do have a lot of questions, and we have less than 15 minutes left. So I'll start picking some which are, yeah, I mean, I'm so sorry, guys, that we will not be able to answer them all. I mean, feel free to email Jansu Hoja after the seminar, but I mean, hopefully we'll be able to cover at least half of them. So I'm just going to select the ones that are probably not answered at all, because some of them are already answered partially. Starting with Batuhan's question. Definition of ethics is affected by different things, including culture. For multicultural institutions, should the law be implemented by the institutions, or because of the definitional difference that culture creates, should it be implemented by the countries? If the answer is the second option, how can the differences between the regulations of states affect the decision-making processes of the institutions? The second question is coming from Sarkan Berk Bilgic. Thank you for your very informative presentation. We clearly need AI every now and then because I'm having difficulty reading because I don't have my spectacles. And so as you see, we do need sometimes AI to bypass the deficiencies we have. I was gonna say, I want to ask why technology is ahead of ethics. I mean, we can predict the future of technology more or less, but why we're not trying to take an action before we invent the technology? For example, Richard Feynman, long before that, as I remember 50 years ago, said computers can think. At that time, there was no such thing as artificial intelligence, but today we are talking about ethics of AI. Did we talk about this 50 years ago? If we talk, did we pay enough attention? Also, I want to add philosophy and ethics mostly based on thinking. So it is not necessary for us to see it really to think on it, then why we cannot fix ethical issues before technology entering our lives. I hope I could explain my question. I think Jansu Hojam got it.
I got it. I got
Okay.
it.
Thank
So
you.
Let me start with the culture question. It's a good question. And actually, a major Chinese company asked me this question, just like exactly with those words almost just a week ago. I think there are a couple of things. One is that ethics is not culture dependent. So when we say ethics, the definition of ethics is culture dependent, that's not really correct. Ethics is really talking about what is the right decision, what is the good thing to do, what is the fair thing to do. And it's this is the ethics of, this is the question of ethics across cultures. Give you a background. Also, I have Mary Hoja mentioned in the beginning, but I did study and practice in Southeast Asia and in the US and in Europe. So like I am pretty confident about my culture background of AI ethics studies and practice. What does change, however, which is where this question is really going, is different considerations when we are making our ethics calculations, so to speak. So if a particular culture is really sensitive about privacy, for example, much more than another culture, that is a relevant factor to take into account. And there, of course, we should not just say, no, privacy matters only this much. That's a bit of a short-sighted view because people have different value trade-offs and value judgments, and certainly cultures have that aspect too. So there we do need the help from social sciences to help us tell us what are those different social sensitivities are. And then that feeds into the way that we practice ethics. Sometimes it can be as simple as asking the question in a right way. So in one example in bioethics is, for example, they would say that Japanese people don't care about autonomy, they care about harmony, but Westerners, Americans care about autonomy. Well, that's a misleading way of putting it. I think as a doctor, you should always respect your patient's autonomy, but maybe in a way that you ask the question, you should suggest the Japanese patient, how about you go and discuss it with your family and come back to me with your decision? So like sort of like understanding how the decision process is done in that culture. When it comes to how to, so from an ethics perspective, I can tell this is how we should do like our analysis. So understanding the cultural perspectives as well and taking that into account. When it comes to regulation and law, that's a question, again, I don't think is really my expertise, but I would sort of defer to the existing structure. We have cultural differences in already, and we have laws and regulations already in different countries, and we have major corporations acting and operating in different geographies. I don't know whether the solution that they have come up with is the best solution, but I guess there is something probably to utilize in the legal structure to answer this question that I cannot answer. And for the second question, yes, about the why don't we think about these ethics questions before we invent? Well, one good answer, I don't know, or bad answer, I'm not sure, is that we do. Just look at the philosophy literature. We've been talking about machines and their ethical behavior since antiquity, basically, imagining these gods making things, inanimate things into machines, so to speak. Well, apparently it didn't really caught the eye of the computer science people, so I guess that's like a bad thing. But we can say that we have a lot of literature, and the literature you can sort of, I mentioned how the AI ethics did not take off, but you should go back and check like machine ethics, for example, which was a big deal, internet ethics, which was a big deal. It was not exactly the same as AI ethics, but it did answer, it did touch upon a lot of the questions that we are asking now about AI ethics. So machine ethics, robot ethics, internet ethics, information technology ethics, all of these are relevant subfields. But I'm not like, how much should it feed into the computer, like innovation, really, computer science practice in academia and in private sector? Well, it would be great if we have, going back to this earlier question, if we have had ethics classes as a part, as an integral and solid part of computer science education. But it will always be some innovation that we didn't think properly about, and we have not foreseen the consequences. I think the point is to have a mechanism that can address this as fast as possible. Competent people who work in the area, who can give quick and immediate reactions, processes that can review and react to these new innovations and potential mistakes, and the literature that we can draw upon, which already exists.
Thank you so much, Hocam. I'm also getting some direct messages, so I'm checking them also at the same time. We have one on explainable AI. We already touched upon that. Let's actually continue with Gülce Günar's question, because she's a senior philosophy student and an enthusiastic person about applied philosophy. She's saying, I personally wondered your motivations to go towards AI ethics. And also, I want to hear your opinions on how can we prevent violation of AI ethics and weaponization of artificial intelligence as an ordinary citizen? In which ways people can contribute to that? A related questions coming from Shilan Berfin Dolançay. Thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to know how we can personally contribute for better practices in AI.
Starting with the beginning of the question, how I did go into AI ethics. I am an applied ethicist from the beginning. So I did study applied ethics, and my area of work was health and ethics. So I did work for 15 years, I think now, in the health policies, public health ethics, bioethics. Some call it population level bioethics. And the way that I went into AI was really, I was teaching in Hong Kong, at the University of Hong Kong in the medical school, and we got a lot of health technologies coming and presenting their great AI systems. And the interesting thing is that, of course, as bioethicists, as the ethics people in the medical school, we talk about the ethical problems related to the physician, to the hospital, to the healthcare system, to the patient. We have absolutely no idea what goes into the technology or who is developing this healthcare technology. And that's, as these systems become more and more intelligent and interesting, it is a huge missing point. So my interest was really to figure this missing piece. But then AI is a very interesting topic, and there are also not just healthcare, there are also other fun areas of it. So I sort of went to discover those other questions as well. But I still use a lot of health background because healthcare ethics is really one of the most developed applied ethics areas. So that is one of the best help you can get about these questions related to resource allocation or individual well-being questions and all of those things. And how can we engage with this AI ethics question as ordinary citizens? So I'm going to first give like a very philosophy perspective answer. Deliberation. Just know what you're talking about and don't like do too much shortcuts. Like if you're going to advocate for something, really think through before you advocate for something. Think about the implications of what you're advocating. You know, like just carrying a flag for privacy is not necessarily the right thing to do in all settings. What do you mean by privacy? And is it really good to have privacy in all cases? Think about all of these things before you advocate, but then do advocate and take action. You know, if you think that a particular company is not on your best interest, consider not using their products. And if you think that something else is for your best interest, then consider using it. You know, if you are sharing your data with Facebook for you know, checking yourself in certain cafes, but you're not using it for public health service, for public health reasons, well, you know, there is a problem there. Think about why you're doing what you're doing, and be vocal about it, I would say.
Thank you very much, Hocam. I guess this has to be our last question, which is actually in a way a good conclusion of asking you what you think about, okay, let me actually start from the beginning. Nisa Ozar is asking, to me, your perspective on AI seems more optimistic than the previous perspectives of seminars, especially the last one that we questioned. If AI is eating the world, that was the title of our previous seminar. Is it because you believe that it is possible for AI to be ethically applied in sectors?
I watched that seminar. I find it really difficult to be very pessimistic about about most things actually, because I think when you really pay attention, the world was never a great place and it's never going so badly, you know. So there are many things that are really going well, and I would say having search engines is amazing. I wouldn't want to go back to do my research in libraries only. There are so many things that I would say that's great in technology that I would find it a bit, again, sort of missing the whole picture if we say, oh, that's horrible. I mentioned this healthcare tools where you find patients like me and really can get more evidence-based treatments and diagnosis. So all of these are benefits of technology, and we are definitely using the benefits of technology. And the technology does have potential for a lot more. So I'm not sure why should we sort of like treat it as something bad. We never treat, like, you know, we have all like cars kill people. We don't we don't call cars evil. We just figure out what is the best way to use them, and we appreciate being able to go from one place to another place really fast. So I don't think we should be negative or positive. I think we should just have a healthy attitude of criticism and paying attention to what works and what doesn't work, and what we need and what we don't need. In the end, by the way, again, one thing that is being increasingly talked about, but not the spotlight, is AI is very costly, and AI is very environmentally costly. So if we are using AI systems, we should make sure that we are using it for the right purposes, and we don't unnecessarily complicate things and put a burden on the environment. But then again, there will be so many areas that AI will be useful, and it is. I mean, I don't think we even have to sort of look further to the future. Right now, it is what you use, and you're enjoying it, and your life is, I would say, probably better because of it. So, but your life is also, you also have more risks because of it. So let's make sure that we mitigate them.
Thank you so much, Ajam. On behalf of GLODEM and MACSSL, let me thank you very much again for both this really inspirational seminar and for sparing time to answer all our questions. I mean, I guess the volume of the questions also reveal how badly we need a course on AI ethics, because most of the questions actually came from our students. So let me thank them. Also thank our audience, everyone, for asking questions and making this a really lively discussion for us all. And apologies for those who didn't get to ask their questions. I mean, I guess they can email Jasa Hojam if they would like to hear her opinion. So with that, I think we will conclude the seminar today. It may actually be the last seminar of the semester. We don't know that yet. There is a possibility that we may have another seminar. We're still waiting on our speakers to confirm that. But if not, then this was actually, I think, a great way to conclude the semester as well. So thank you very much, Jam Sojam, and thank you all. Hope to see you very soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And yes, please do feel free to email me. And it was very much fun because of all your questions. Otherwise, I'm just lecturing, really. So it's not good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and have a nice weekend.